So, should I simply start?
Добрый день всем еще раз. Меня зовут Александр. Я из команды Московского политеха. Мы рады приветствовать в Москве Ричарда Столлмана и всех вас, кто пришел послушать его открытую лекцию. Спасибо.
I'll tell you that it'll fit in a super point in the talk. So before I actually start, I'd like to tell you some conditions about making photos and recordings. Now, it's okay to make photos of me if you do it the right way. First of all, don't ask first. Just do it. Please don't take up my time asking me one by one for permission. This is telling all of you the answer. Second, please do not put any photo that shows me into Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, because those are the three mouths of a surveillance monster that devours personal data in order to track people. It can recognize people by their faces or the backs of their heads. So if you put into Facebook a photo in which a person appears, you are helping the monster track that person. It's a bad thing to do to your friends, and please don't ever do that to me. Second, if you want to take a photo with a mobile device, watch out, because mobile devices tend to copy the geolocation into the metadata of the photo, and then if you give a copy of that photo to anybody else, it tracks the person in the photo, or the persons in the photo. So before you take a photo of me with a mobile device, turn off saving geolocation in the metadata. And once that's done, just take photos at any time you wish, don't ask. For recordings, it's a different issue. You're welcome to make recordings and distribute copies. But first, make sure that the site where you distribute them allows anybody to download a copy without having to run any non-free JavaScript code. Most of the sites that are set up to distribute videos, instead of just making the video directly available to whoever wants to access it, which would work just fine, they make the visitor run a non-free program in JavaScript in order to access the video, and that is an injustice. And it would be especially ironic when applied to a video of my talk. Here, I'm going to tell people why they should refuse to run that non-free program, and you'll be saying, in order to hear Stallman explain this, run this non-free program. You may not know about it, but that's what most sites do. So, make sure you choose a distribution site that does not do this. And then, there's one last thing. Put on the license Creative Commons No Derivatives, because this is a presentation of a point of view. So, today's talk is about copyright versus community in the age of the computer networks. This is the answer to a question people used to ask me at the end of the talk about free software. They'd say, okay, I understand why software should be free, but does this apply to anything else? What about hardware? What about music? So to give you the answer, I first have to explain about free software, so you'll understand the question. So, free software is software that respects users' freedom and community. So we're talking about freedom. Is this working or? That worked. So we're talking about freedom, not price. It's свободный software. We do not mean бесплатно. We're not concerned with price at all. For us, whether you pay money to get a copy of a program or receive it without charge, that's a minor detail. We're concerned with something important, and that is, once you have a program and you use it, how does it treat you? Does it respect your freedom, or does it crush your freedom? Does it respect your community, or does it divide people and break up your community? These are important ethical issues raised by software. So, what is a program? What is a computer? Well, a computer is a universal computing engine. But really, it only knows how to do one general basic thing. Get the next instruction and do whatever that says. And then get the next instruction and do what that says. And the next and the next. Millions of times per second, it will get an instruction and do what that instruction says. The instructions come from a program. Depending on what instructions are in that program, it will direct your computer to do this, or that, 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 or that. You know, in principle, it's starting to drop out. In principle, an infinite set of possible programs and an infinite set of possible jobs that your computer could do. In fact, with the right program, the computer could do absolutely anything except the impossible things that no computer can ever do. But within the realm of what is possible, your computer could do anything given the right set of instructions. A program is just a set of instructions. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. You might think your computer is obeying you, when really it's obeying its true master all the time. And its true master decides what it's allowed to do for you. So the true master is always really in control. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's always one or the other. What the hell's happening here? Oh no. How do I make it back up? I want to move it. Okay. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why so? Well, what is freedom? Freedom means having control over what you do in your life, over the activities you do in your life. But if you use a program to do the activity, control of the activity requires control of the program. So when the users control the program, what the? No, it's going the wrong way. How do I make it back up? I don't know what this controller is. It's not mine. Back more. Oh. Okay, I didn't know that. And now what do I do to make it back up? What I want to reverse. I want to go to the previous slide. How do I do that? Okay. So when the users control the program, then they decide what to do with it. And it respects their freedom and community, so it's free software. Practically speaking, in order for users to have control of the program, they need the 4 essential freedoms. These 4 freedoms make the practical criterion for whether a program is free. If the program carries the 4 freedoms, then it's free software. So freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program however you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so the program does your computing activity the way you wish. Why do we insist on source code? Well, over there you see some source code. It's like a mixture of English and math. If you've learned the programming language, you can read the source code, understand it, and change it to do something different. But in order to run it, we convert it into executable code. The executable code is an enigmatic series of 1s and 0s, which is not easy to understand. Well, for a trivial program like this, it's not a lot of work to see what instructions those 1s and 0s represent and what they do. But when you get to a somewhat bigger program, it gets to be a pain. And for a real program, which might have 100 million 1s and 0s, figuring out what they tell the computer to do is a giant, hard job. It's not enough just to look up what instructions they are. Figuring out what all those instructions will actually do is even harder. So if the developer gives the users these 1s and 0s and says, you're free to change them if you can figure out what they mean, that is not respect for freedom, that is mockery of freedom. Free software requires availability of the source code. These 2 freedoms, 0 and 1, together give us separate control over the program. Here you see separate control, 4 users of the same program. One of them is changing per copy, and the others are free to do it, but they're not doing it. With separate control, I have control over my copies, you have control over your copies, you have control over your copies, and so on. Separate control is essential, but it is not enough, because most users are not programmers. They don't know how to read or change source code, and there's no reason why they should, because they do other things. There are many interesting, important, and necessary things to do in life. And people have different natural abilities and different skills. It would be to give people control by saying to everybody, you have to learn to program, that wouldn't work. But how can these non-programmers have control over how a program functions? Through collective control. Collective control is the freedom to work together with other users to control how the program should work for you. At the top, we see a group of 3 users that are collaborating to change this program to work the way they want. 2 of them on the right are touching the code. They must be programmers. The one on the left is not touching the code. Maybe that user is not a programmer, but they decide together what changes to make. That's how a non-programmer can participate in controlling how the program works. Those who collaborate in this way are those who choose to collaborate. At the bottom, there are 2 more users running the original version, the usual version of the same program. They are not working with those 3. We don't know why not. It could be any reason, because it's up to them. If they want to work together, they're free to do so. If they prefer not to, well, nobody's going to try to force them. So, though a bunch of users can work together if they wish. Collective control requires two more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies of the program and then give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make copies of your modified version and then give or sell them to others when you wish. With these two freedoms, the members of a group can work together. If one member of the group makes a modified version, person under freedom 3 can make copies of that version and distribute them to others in the group. Then they, with freedom 2, can make more copies of the same version and distribute them to others in the group.
Is it 3 persons or company?
Sorry, what? These can be individuals, they can be companies, they can be governments, they can be universities, any kind of user. I have a feeling that the microphone is dropping out. Are you still able to hear me? Is there any problem? Have there been moments when you could not hear me?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
There were moments when we could hear your voice, but still.
Well, I'm not sure what to do with the microphone. Sorry. I guess I don't understand. What am I supposed to... If this touches my skin, does it stop? It doesn't. It's still working. The dropouts, I think, are because the battery is getting low. No? It's a flaw in the system then. In the past, I have seen these things happen when the battery is almost out of power, and after another half hour, it stops entirely. That's what I have experienced. Anyway, a group does not have to have a name or a formal structure or a list of members. If some users start working together, they're a group, at least for this moment, as long as they keep working together. And if some more join them, then the group is bigger. So freedoms 2 and 3 do not have any limits about who you can redistribute to. You can offer copies to anyone at all. You can even offer copies to the general public, which means publishing that version. So if the program carries the 4 essential freedoms, then the users control the program so it respects their freedom in community and it's free software. And because the 4 freedoms are the most important point, I will repeat them now. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the program's source code and change it so it functions the way you wish. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and then give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So those are the freedoms that define a free program, but if one of those freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the users do not really control the program. Instead, it's the program that controls the users, and the program's owner controls the program. Here you see the essential injustice of any non-free program. It creates a system of unjust power, power for the program's owner over the users. It gives one entity power over others. And this is what makes it unjust. So non-free software should not exist because users deserve to control their own computing and should not be subjugated to anyone else. Therefore, you should never work on developing a non-free program, because that means creating more injustice. It's better to do nothing than develop a non-free program. If you do nothing, at least you're not doing harm. Developing a non-free program is doing harm. Now, in some circumstances, we have to forgive you. If somebody with a gun points it at you and says, write this non-free program or I'll shoot, most of the time, in most circumstances, I would forgive you for that. But if it's just a way to make money, no, you should make money some other way. Maybe work as a waiter. There's nothing evil about working as a waiter. So morally, it's preferable to working developing non-free software and taking away other people's freedom. Well, this is the initial injustice of a non-free program, the automatic injustice simply because it's non-free. But typically it leads to other injustices because the owner has power over the users and the owner knows it. Therefore, the owner is tempted to write the code to mistreat the users in ways that benefit the owner. In other words, to introduce malicious functionalities. Nowadays, it's normal practice for non-free programs to have malicious functionalities of many different kinds. So one of them is spying on the users. That's very common. It seems that most non-free programs available for users to use spy on the users. This example is the Amazon Swindle, Amazon's ebook reader. Its official name is not Swindle, but Swindle describes what it does. It swindles the readers out of the traditional freedoms of readers of books. For instance, to read a book in privacy without telling anyone else what book the person is reading. The swindle automatically tells Amazon about everything significant that the user does. It sends the title of the book. It sends the page number of the book. If the user highlights any text, sent to Amazon. If the user enters notes, they're sent to Amazon. Complete Orwellian surveillance of reading. But this is one example among thousands. The 5 usual proprietary operating systems spy. I'm talking about Windows, macOS, Android, iOS, and Chromos. Each one sends personal data to the company. And the apps spy also. Somebody studied, I think, the 1,000 most popular Android apps, checking for one particular spying mechanism that could be detected without the source code. The source code of these apps was not available. They are nie swobodni. So, but still the investigator could check for one kind of spying and found that of the paid apps, 60% spied on the user. And of the gratis apps, 90% spied on the user. So I'm justified in saying that spying on the user is the usual case. A program that fails to spy is an exception in the non-free world. And this is just one kind of spying. Some of those programs do other kinds of spying. For instance, look at streaming apps like Spotify and Netflix. Well, if you don't agree, you don't have to say it that way. So, those apps require users to identify themselves in order to pay. And then they keep a dossier of everything that the user listened to or everything that the user watched. Now, that sounds like the Soviet Union to me. This is one additional reason why I will never use those things. I say, out, out, damned Spotify. And then transportation apps like Uber and Yandex, well, they make users identify themselves. They have to use a non-free app, which is the first reason why I would never use any of those companies. I refuse to run non-free programs. But the second reason is that they keep a dossier about each user's movements. This should be illegal. It should be illegal for a transportation company to identify the passengers, because that is it's too useful for tyranny. If we want to have a free country, we have to put an end to tracking people's movements. That's evil too, but it's a different subject. That's not based on getting you to run non-free software, but it still is evil. So yes, there are various different ways that tracking and surveillance are done. Sometimes it's done through non-free software in your computer, and sometimes it's done through some other system that isn't yours. And we have to get rid of all of it, but what I'm talking about now is free software. If you want to look at what I say about the other issues of surveillance, look at gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-democracy.html. How much surveillance can democracy withstand? Anyway, it's not just snooping on the user. Many programs nowadays, non-free programs, are tied to a particular server and can only work with that server. The interface between the program and the server is secret, so you can't talk to the server through some other program, even if you want to write one. Many products, physical products, now talk to the person who bought them through the manufacturer's server. The Fitbit was the first example I learned about. It collects personal data, that's its purpose. And then the user, to get that personal data, has to go to the manufacturer's server. The manufacturer offers to sell them to the user per own personal data, which I think is quite a lot of nerve. But nowadays, that architecture has become standard in the Internet of Things. That's what I call it. The marketing term is Internet of Things, but I don't want things like that in my life. Because if the way the user controls the product is communicating through the manufacturer's server, the manufacturer watches everything. And if the results are sent back that way, the manufacturer sees the results too. There is a security camera where the user has to connect through the manufacturer's server, which means the manufacturer is always watching. Security against everybody but one, and total insecurity against that one. There's even a sex toy designed to accept commands from somebody else over the internet. And guess what? somebody else has to send the commands by connecting to the manufacturer's server. So that means the manufacturer knows everything that the toy is used to do. It sees all the commands and any responses. But that's not enough. It wants to snoop on people even more. So it built a thermometer into the toy. The users don't need the thermometer. But the thermometer enables the company to determine when the toy is in contact with a human body, which the manufacturer wants to know. And I suspect it can also determine how the toy is in contact with the human body. As soon as I saw that described, I thought, oh, this is going to spy on people. It's horrible. It's for suckers. But they all are. And by the way, I read that Google had a plan for its home controller, that any other company that wanted to set up its device to be controlled by Google's home controller would have to agree to inform Google every time the status of that product changed. Even if the user gave it a command in some other way, Google would still be informed. In other words, any device that can be controlled by the home controller, if this plan goes through, then it will always be spying for Google. That shows how they arrogantly want to convert everything in people's homes into their spies. And the other thing they can do, I forgot to advance. This is the slide about that problem. And the other thing they can do is they can turn off the server. They could turn off your account and lock you out. And then you couldn't use the product you bought. Or they could shut off the server completely and lock everybody out. And nobody could use those products anymore. And this has happened many times. But then there's another kind of malicious functionality, digital handcuffs, or DRM, digital restrictions management. The malicious functionality of stopping you from doing what the manufacturer doesn't want to let you do. This example is the blu-ray that attacks users when they try to copy. I am using a bit of comedic license here. Really what the Blu-ray disc does, it's designed so that the data is encrypted in such a way that we don't know how to copy that data. And as far as I'm concerned, that makes it totally intolerable. I don't have free software I can use to access or copy Blu-ray discs, so I have never used a Blu-ray disc, and I never will, because when a product is designed specifically to restrict people, I am not going to surrender to that. I would rather reject all the movies ever made than give up my freedom to a Blu-ray disc. But lots of products and programs implement DRM. The 5 usual proprietary operating systems implement the base for DRM, and then most of the apps that operate on media implement DRM itself. And the Amazon Swindle has DRM. And my rule is, if a device was made to restrict me, then unless I have what's necessary to break the handcuffs, I won't use it at all. Then there are back doors. A back door listens for commands coming in from someone else, commands to do something nasty to the user. it's hard to detect a backdoor in a non-free program because you don't have the source code. You can't study it to see if you can find a backdoor. The only way is to observe it functioning. And that's how people discovered that the Amazon swindle has a backdoor for remotely erasing books. In 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in a grand Orwellian act. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. So there was a lot of criticism, and Amazon said it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that's not a very comforting promise, is it? But it wasn't a promise either. Amazon just said that so that the criticism would die away. And a few years later, Amazon resumed remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. Well, we know of some other backdoors. iOS has a backdoor with which Apple can remotely erase any app. Whether it really physically gets erased from memory or merely deactivated irrevocably, I don't know, and it doesn't actually matter. Android has an even more powerful backdoor. Google can erase any app, or it can forcibly install any app. In general, a backdoor is used to make the machine do to the user something the user wouldn't choose to do for herself. Probably because it's nasty. Now, a backdoor in a driverless taxi would be extremely dangerous. You could get in and say, "Take me to the train station," and someone would tell it through the back door to take you to the Lubyanka prison or the CIA black site with the doors shut. The only way you can trust a driverless taxi is if it can't tell who you are. Then there is censorship. Apple was the pioneer of censorship of apps. The iPhone was the first generally useful computer in which users were not free to install the applications of their choice. They could only install applications approved by Apple from Apple's store. Apple practiced its censorship power arbitrarily based on its commercial interests and its political positions until 2017, at which point China ordered Apple to block all VPN applications. And Apple just had to obey slavishly. Apple had given itself the power to do this, and China knew it. So there was no way Apple could excuse refusing to obey China. If Apple had not done this evil in the first place, then it would have had a response. It could have said, "China, you know we always want to please you. But in this case, we just can't. We don't control what users install. And so we can't block anything. Please forgive me, China." But because Apple greedily grabbed the power to censor, it had to censor for China. When the users defeat the censorship, they call it jailbreaking, recognizing that this machine is designed as a jail for its user. So that's our term for this kind of system. It's a jail. Another kind of malicious functionality is subscriptions. Many programs nowadays, non-free programs nowadays, will stop working on a certain date if the user doesn't pay again. Now this, say 20 years ago, this nasty practice made users very angry. It was called a time bomb. But the users are so downtrodden and so spiritless that they even surrender to these time bombs because they don't think they have a choice. And together with the time bomb, which often requires the user to connect to the internet regularly so it can verify the subscription is still there, that often is connected with spying, as the data that users are working on gets sent to some company's server where various governments can easily look at it. Sometimes there's a universal backdoor. That means a backdoor that has the power to forcibly change the code. There is a universal backdoor in Windows that has been there since Windows XP. Experts studying some of the output deduced that Microsoft had the power to forcibly change the code. Microsoft refused to acknowledge this, but in Windows Vista, it proudly announced that it had this power, using a nicer sounding name. It's called auto upgrade, or auto downgrade, as the case may be. Whatever it is, it means that Microsoft can forcibly change the software running the user's computer, meaning that if your computer is running Windows, Microsoft has owned your computer. Now, there's also a universal backdoor in the Amazon swindle. More importantly, just about every model of portable phone ever made had a universal backdoor, or still has it, if it's still in use. This is in the radio processor, also known as the baseband or modem processor, meaning it's at a lower level than Android or iOS. They run in a different processor. But the radio processor is the one that connects to the microphone, and it has a universal backdoor. So they use this to convert the phone into a full-time listening device, just by changing the software so it listens and transmits all the time. Governments can do this, criminals can do this.
Okay, Google.
What? I can't hear you, what?
Okay, Google. That's enough.
Well, that's a different listening device. But this this backdoor existed in non-smartphones and still does. When you put that together with the fact that the phone network tracks the movements of the phone, well, what is this thing? I call it Stalin's dream. What would Stalin have wanted to give to everybody in the Soviet Union? A device that would track per movements and listen to the conversations around per all the time. Too bad for Stalin, the technology didn't exist then. But it exists now, and almost all of society has been herded into accepting these devices. First, people were offered advantages over other people by getting them. And now there are efforts to deny us the ability to do various things without them. So I consider it my duty as a citizen to resist. I've never had a portable phone. I don't intend ever to have a portable phone unless I can prevent it from doing these two unjust things to me. It doesn't matter what convenience it might offer me. The idea of being mistreated that way makes me so angry that I have the strength to say no. I do use portable phones. I use lots of different portable phones. If I'm in a bus and it's going to be late and I want to tell my friends, I ask the people around me, will you send a text for me? So, I hope I've shown you that non-free programs are malicious in many ways. Oh, there are more. Sometimes the program is designed to get the user addicted and make it difficult for the user to turn attention away from the program. And this causes real harm to people. Those programs often work with a particular server, and some of the addictiveness is due to the server. But the program has an influence as well, and if you could change the code of the program, you could make it less addictive. So the fact that the program is non-free and you can't change it does do additional harm.
You need some sort of gamification, or you need
Some sort of what occasion? What?
gamification?
Well, sometimes they're games. Yeah, gamification is one aspect, but even, Facebook does this and games do this. But the point is, you could make it less addictive and still play the game if you could change the way the software presents what's happening.
What about hardware?
That's a different subject, please. Don't try to send me off on a tangent. I have a complicated subject to get through. So questions like that, ask at the end if there's time. So, what this means is non-free software tends to be malware. Oh, this is something else. This is not a functionality. This is a malicious maintenance practice. When Microsoft learns of a security flaw in Windows, before fixing it, it tells the NSA. So the NSA can enter the computers of users of Windows. Do you think the Russian government should use Windows? In any case, I think no government should use Windows or any other non-free software, and nobody else should use them either. You see, we have information in the press that Microsoft was doing this. For the other companies, we just don't know. Maybe they're doing the same thing, or maybe not. But what it tells us is, if you're using non-free software, you're almost certainly a victim of proprietary malware. I've given you just a few examples, but almost everyone that uses some non-free software is using one of those examples. So almost everybody's a victim. And we have hundreds of examples. Look at GNU.org/malware. So the reason they do it is they found ways to make more money by mistreating their users. And they have no moral scruples. So at this point, it's important to note that any program can be released as free software. And any program can be released as non-free software. And almost always, it's possible to release the same program as free software and non-free software in parallel at the same time. This is because the difference between free software and non-free software is purely a matter of how the program is made available to users. It's not directly a question of what's in the code. By contrast, the difference between malware and honest software is purely a matter of what's in the code. Is it implemented to do some nasty thing or not? So these are independent dimensions. Free or non-free based on how it's made available to people, honest or malware depending on what the code says. All combinations are possible in principle. but not all combinations are encountered very often in real life. In real life, free software is almost always honest, and non-free software tends to be malware. There's a systematic reason for this. Power corrupts. The developers of non-free programs have power over the users, and they know it, so they have been corrupted. It has become normal practice in the proprietary world to put in malicious functionalities and mistreat the users. And it follows that there's never a rational basis for trusting a non-free program, because you should know that they're mistreating you. If you trust them despite what you've learned, well, the only way to do that is with blind faith. And how can you give blind faith to a company that has already mistreated people? There's never a rational basis to trust a non-free program. But with free software there is, and the reason it's that you know that the users are in control of that program. There's a user community for that program, and those users can study the source code and change it, and sometimes they do. And in the process, if there's anything bad in the program, whether it's an intentional malicious functionality or a bug, the users can find it and fix it. And this means the user community has a defense which is absent for non-free software. The users of a non-free program are totally defenseless against the power of the owner. With free software, the users have a defense, and that means there's a rational basis to trust that the program probably is honest. It's not a perfect defense. It's not a guarantee, but it's the only defense that is known. The only known way to protect yourself from malicious functionalities is to insist on free software. How hard the users work to make sure there are no malicious functionalities, well, the harder the users, the more effort the users put into that, the smaller the chance of anything nasty gets. But the first step in having any kind of security is to have control over the program. And here is where collective control makes a crucial difference. Because, of course, I don't expect most users to study the code for any particular program. But some users do from time to time. And that gives them a chance to spot and remove any possible malicious functionality. And we contributors know that users can do that. We know that we don't have power the way the proprietary developers do. And that lack of power protects us from corruption. So, basically, if you use a non-free program, you're asking to be taken. Don't do it. Escape from non-free software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. We built it with the GNU operating system and the Linux kernel. I started developing GNU in 1984 because I wanted freedom in my computing, and I wanted you to have freedom also. The purpose of GNU was to make it possible to run computers in freedom. In 1991, GNU was almost complete, but one important component was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel of an operating system allocates the computer's resources to the other programs you run. We started a kernel in 1990, but I made a bad decision perhaps. I chose a powerful, advanced, elegant architecture, and it took us 6 years to get it to run at all. But in 1991, Mr. Torvalds wrote a kernel called Linux and got it to work within a year. Unfortunately, in 1991, Linux was not free software. But in 92, he made it free software, and at that point, it was possible to use Linux to fill the last gap in the GNU system, producing a complete free operating system that made it possible to use a PC in freedom. This combination is basically the GNU system plus Linux. It's the GNU/Linux system. But as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of people talk about it, calling it Linux without mentioning GNU, which means they're giving us none of the credit and attributing our work to someone else, someone who is a real contributor but started later and didn't do as much. And that's being unfair to us. So I ask you, please give us equal mention. Please make a point of calling the system GNU/Linux. In principle, GNU/Linux is a free operating system, but in practice, it's usually not. There are thousands of different variants called distros. Each one has its own development team which decides which programs to put in that version. Well, if it puts in one non-free program, that distribution is no longer a free operating system. You can no longer count on it to respect your freedom. Unfortunately, there are thousands of non-free distros. Each of them is mostly free software, but also has non-free programs. And there are just a few free distros that hold to a rigorous moral standard. So to find out more about them, look at gnu.org/distros. I am sad to report that nowadays, many websites, many web pages contain non-free software that gets sent to your browser and it executes in your computer. Thank you. Well, we didn't want to run those non-free programs, so we developed a way to stop it. It's called Libre.js. It's an extension for Firefox that analyzes the non-free it analyzes the programs in the web pages to see which ones are trivial and which ones carry a free license. If the program is trivial or free, then it can run. If a program is non-trivial and non-free, then Libre.js blocks it to protect your freedom. And you can tell this is happening because there's an icon on the screen that changes color. It also makes it easy for you to complain to the webmasters. It searches heuristically through the site for where and how to contact the webmasters, so you can easily send a complaint. Please do send a complaint. It'll take you just a minute. And it's important for the webmasters to get complaints for this. Nowadays, there's another way you can lose control of your own computing activity. And that is, if you entrust that computing activity to somebody else's server, you can't possibly control how somebody else's server does the job. In the old days, you would do a computing activity by running a program in your computer. If the program was free, you had control over it. If it was non-free, you lost control over that activity. And that's still true, but nowadays there's also the misguided option of letting somebody else's server do your computing for you. And if you do that, you lose control over that computing. It's equivalent to running a non-free program, it leads to the same consequences, the same result, but it gets there through a different pathway. In any case, the whole point is to maintain control over your own computing, which is what you deserve. And that means you need to learn to say no thanks when somebody says, send all your data to my server and I will do this computing for you and send you back the results. You need to realize that that is an invitation to give up your freedom and say no. So nowadays, in addition to non-free programs, you have to be on guard against internet disservices, so-called services that do nasty things to you and deny you control over your own computing. I'll skip that. It's about surveillance, but there's no time. There are obstacles to the advance of freedom. One of them is the term open source. Why do some people say open source? It was the slogan for rejecting the ideas of the free software movement. I started the free software movement in 1983, and we were campaigning for the principle that users deserve freedom, that users deserve control of their own computing. And in the 1990s, this idea was at least getting considered, but some people in the community didn't like that. In 1990, there were people who liked the free programs, but they didn't like the fact that we had moral ideas about those free programs. So in 1998, they looked for a way to co-opt our practical software and disconnect it from our ideas so that the ideas would be buried and forgotten. They did that with the term open source. It was in 1998 that they adopted the term open source and then constructed a different discourse using that term. A discourse which did not mention right or wrong, which did not present any issues of freedom and justice. They didn't say that if programs were not open source, they were mistreating you. They didn't tell users to reject those programs at all. The only values they appealed to were those of practical advantage. We say if you develop and release a program, it's your moral duty to respect the user's freedom to change and redistribute it. The open source people say if you develop and release a program, please consider whether it's in your practical advantage to let the users change and redistribute the program. For instance, they might improve the code quality by sending you bug reports and contributions. Well, yes, they might. But in the free software movement, we think that's a secondary issue. That's a side point, because the really important point is users deserve control over that program. And the only way they have it is if they're allowed to change it and redistribute it. So you must respect their freedom, and if you don't, you're doing wrong. In open source, they don't talk about right and wrong. It's an amoral approach. Well, in 1998, most of the users and most of the businesses agreed with open source. So the media began talking about open source and never free software. And the result is we have to work hard to make people aware that there is a free software movement. And so many people have been misinformed. They think that open source is the only idea there ever was in this area of philosophy. So if they hear about me and GNU, they assume we are an open source project. I've even seen articles that called me the father of open source, which is not true, and rather frustrating. So I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I present the name of free software and explain what it stands for. That's the serious part of the letter, but it's fun to start with a joke. So I do as much as I can to inform people of the free software idea, but I can't do enough. The other free software activists do what they can. We need more. You can help just by saying свободный software and not talking about open source or closed. It's one thing to understand an idea or agree with it. It's another to tell others. If you want freedom to win, you've got to tell other people that freedom is important, and first tell people what it means. And every time you say open source, you are helping to bury our ideas. So it's up to you. In that point, at least, you're still free to say whichever one you wish. So human rights depend on each other, which means if you lose one human right, it becomes harder to defend the others. It's harder to win back a human right than to avoid losing it. Well, people in Moscow are now trying to win back a human right that they have lost. And I admire their persistence and determination. But that applies in computing as well.
Those are Facebook drones.
What?
Those are Facebook and drones.
I don't believe you. The protesters?
Yes.
No, that's nonsense.
No, fuck you!
Well, I'm going to continue with my talk. The point is that nowadays, free software, in other words, control of your computing, is one of the human rights we need in order to defend the others. That's because we use computing for so many important things in society. So we've got to resist non-free software that would take this freedom away from us. And that means sometimes you have to make a sacrifice of convenience. Sometimes you have to do some work. Sometimes you have to make efforts or accept inconveniences to keep your freedom or win back your freedom. But when you value freedom enough, the inconvenience isn't the sacrifice. No, giving up your freedom to gain some convenience, that would be the sacrifice. That's the way I feel. I don't even feel tempted to give up freedom to get a convenience. My thought is always, how can I fight? How can I resist? So how can you help our movement? There are lots of things we need. First of all, if you have a talent for programming, contribute to free software projects. But most people don't have a talent for programming. And if you don't, you should contribute some other way. Contribute in a way that's natural for you. So, for instance, you can help organize the movement. It's important to have free software activist groups that campaign to move to free software and to teach people why they need to move to free software. We need, for instance, more speakers to present these ideas. We also need organizers for the groups. The organizer will do things like collect dues every year, maintain the membership list, plan meetings, invite speakers, and tell people when to come. You can help convince governments and schools to move to free software. You can help users. If you're an expert on using GNU/Linux, you can start a GNU/Linux user group and invite people to come and get information and help. If there's an existing GNU/Linux user group, you can go there and help users. If there's an existing group, but it erroneously calls itself a Linux user group, you can go there and help users, but also explain why the group shouldn't call itself that. And just by saying free software or свободный software, as whenever it's pertinent and not talking about open or closed, you're helping us in a very important way, because that's a way to inform people what the issue is. Of course, there are many other kinds of work we need. Look at GNU.org/help. There are dozens of different jobs we are looking for people to do. And for many of them, if you work a few hours a week, over time, it will add up to a lot of help. In addition, in /philosophy, you'll find lots of articles about philosophical or political points. In /licenses, you'll find everything about which licenses are free and which are not. In /government, you'll find our recommended policies for how a government can move to free software. Of course, it will take years to do that, but you have to start, or you won't ever reach the destination. In /education, you'll find everything about why schools must teach exclusively free software, and some schools which are examples. In /GNU, you'll find the history of GNU. In /malware, you'll find hundreds of examples of proprietary malware. And in /distros, you'll find all the information about GNU/Linux distributions, which are free, which are not, how we judge, and so on. You'll also find in fsf.org, the website of the Free Software Foundation. That has resources for using and developing free software. It also has a shop. You can buy things, you can make donations, and you can become an associate member. But you can do that also right here. You can also give a donation, and you can pay cash. Because I'm here, I have a card you can fill out, and you pay your dues. I'll bring it back to Boston, and later this week, I'll hand it in to the Free Software Foundation. Now that you understand the issue of free software, you can understand the question that people asked me. Did these ideas apply to anything other than software? Well, the first thing they said was, what about hardware? Should hardware be free too? It's not very meaningful. The distinction of free versus non-free makes sense for works, things that can exist in copies. But there's no copier for microphones, or teacups, or tea, or GNUs, or clickers, or shoes, or stages, or chairs, or clothing. I mean, most things we use can't be copied, not automatically. You could build another one, but there's no copier that will just look at one and make another one. And as for modifications, well, for physical objects, generally, nobody's going to try to stop you from modifying them. It's just hard. You could modify a shirt. You know, you could embroider on it. You can modify a chair if it's made of wood. It's a bit harder if it's plastic. You could modify it by breaking it into small pieces. Basically, but if it's a chip, you can't modify it at all. Any attempt to modify a chip would just destroy it. So the four freedoms that make sense for software, they don't really make sense for physical things. They do make sense. A hardware design is a work, so it can be free. And regarding hardware designs, I suggest you look at gnu.org/philosophy/free-hardware-designs.html, which says everything I have to say about that topic. Anyway,
Also, that already are 3D printers, so you
but a 3D printer pattern is a work, and it can be free. And if it's a pattern for a useful object, it should be free. But let me get to my talk in the order I've planned, please. Please don't throw out questions I'm going to cover later. Wait to the end. If I haven't covered a certain topic, then ask me about it. So, works, however, can be copied and can be modified. You can have a copy in your computer, and you could have an editor with which to modify it. So for works, the question does make sense. Should they be free? So what's going to make a work non-free? Well, until recently, the only thing that could do so was copyright law. Nowadays, they also use contracts. But first came copyright law, which made works non-free. So the question of what should we be allowed to do with a work, when looked at from the other side, is what should copyright law say about that work? Well, copyright law developed along with copying technology. So let's look briefly at the history of both. In the ancient world, copying was done with a writing instrument. You would read one copy and write another copy. This technology was very inefficient, but had other interesting characteristics. First, there was very little economy of scale. It would take you twice as long to make 2 copies as it would take to make 1 copy. Second, it required no special equipment to make copies. The equipment to make copies was the same as whatever you used for reading and writing. Third, it required no particular skill other than literacy itself. Although it's true, sometimes copies were made by people who were not literate. So the result of this was decentralized production of copies. Anywhere there was a copy, and someone who wanted to do the work of copying it or pay for that work, it would be copied. And nobody tried to stop you. There was no idea of copyright in the ancient world. Sometimes, if the work you wanted to copy criticized the local ruler, then the ruler might punish you. But that was not copyright, that was censorship. Copyright and censorship have been historically related, but that was censorship. It was not copyright. And that went on for thousands of years. But then there was a great advance in copying technology, the printing press, which made copying a lot more efficient in a non-uniform way. In the ancient world, making 1 copy and making many copies were roughly equally slow. But with the printing press, there was a big improvement only for mass production. For making 1 copy, the printing press did not improve it. The fastest way to make 1 copy was to write it by hand. But for mass production, the printing press made things much easier. So the printing press created an economy of scale. It also required expensive special equipment, the press and the type. most literate people didn't own a printing press. They also didn't know how to use one because that was a special skill quite different from reading and writing. Although, of course, if you ran a printing press, it helped if you could read and write. But these changes of an industrial nature had a big effect on the production of copies of books. With the printing press, it was efficient to mass produce copies in a few places and then transport them to where people wanted to buy them. So it completely changed the system of production of copies. Copyright fit into the mass production of copies. Originally, copyright only regulated mass production, printing. It was a system that regulated publishers under the control of the author and was designed to provide benefits to the public in the form of more books that you could read, more contribution to human knowledge and discussions about questions. This, because it didn't restrict the public directly, this law was easy to enforce, uncontroversial, and arguably beneficial for the public. It was uncontroversial because the readers were not restricted. They had nothing to argue against. It was easy to enforce because it only had to be enforced against publishers, and it was easy enough to find who published a given book. And it was arguably beneficial because the public gave up a freedom it had no way to exercise anyway, a notional freedom, and in exchange got more books being written. So it was not a subject of great disputes often, and if we were still in the age of the printing press, I probably wouldn't be campaigning to change something about copyright law. But the age of the printing press is gradually giving way to the age of the computer networks, another big advance in copying technology, which makes copying more efficient in a non-uniform way. Here's what we had in the age of the printing press. One-off copying was still inconvenient, but mass production of copies had got to be very efficient. With digital technology, they both improve, but one-off copying improves more. So we get something like this, where the efficiency of one-off and mass production are almost the same. They're not too far apart anymore, not the way they were in the age of the printing press. So this brings us to a situation more like the ancient world, where anyone can make more copies, and does. So the benefit of digital technology for works is that it becomes easy to copy and manipulate and transfer information, including works. But there are some who don't want us to get this benefit, namely the copyright industry, the publishers that get most of the profit from copyright. They don't want us to get the benefit from this advance in technology, and they've been fighting for many years a war on sharing to deny us this benefit. You see, digital technology transforms the effect of copyright law on society. Even if the law's words were exactly the same, its consequences would be different, because now they try to apply copyright to sharing between individuals, which means now copyright is a restriction on the general public, controlled mainly by the publishers in the name of the artists and authors. Therefore, it is now controversial, hard to enforce, and bad for the public. It is controversial because it's being used to restrict users, and the users resent this. That's why in some countries they have even started political parties, the pirate parties, to demand less powerful copyright restrictions. It is hard to enforce because enforcing it on everybody is not as easy as enforcing it on publishers. And it's clearly harmful because the freedom that we had in theory but couldn't use, so we traded it away and we didn't mind, or rather we let our governments trade it away on our behalf, we can use now, and we want to use it. We want to make copies and share them. So we're really losing something from copyright as it is today. And under this situation, what we ought to do is have our democratic governments reduce copyright power to the point that we can live with. Unfortunately, since democracy is very sick, and in many countries we are ruled by plutocracy, in other words, oligarchs, which is an illegitimate form of government. Democracy is the only legitimate form of government. So what they're doing is the exact opposite, because that's what some of the oligarchs ask them for, or command them to do. We're seeing copyright power increased all around the world. Well, one dimension is the length of copyright. Copyright a few hundred years ago lasted something like 14 years and could be renewed for 14 more years if the author was still alive. But now it has been extended to last until, in most countries, until 70 years after the author's death, which can easily amount to 150 years. It's crazy. What? I can't hear you. What? Yes, Disney extended it by paid. It wasn't only Disney, but Disney paid legislators to extend it by 20 years in the US. And previously, World War II had been the excuse to extend copyright for 20 more years in Europe. But basically, whatever the excuse was, they were always treating it as a matter of what's in the supposed interest of the authors, and the public doesn't count. And in the age of the printing press, that might have been valid because the public wasn't interested in trying to copy and share books. It was too much work. Except in the Soviet Union, they had to copy and share books because they couldn't get them published in the official way. Yeah, I know. The point is, in the US, we didn't have to do that, usually. But in any case, so the worst case is Mexico, where copyright lasts for 100 years after the author's death. So the author's great-great-grandchildren would end up owning the copyright. This is nuts. But what is happening in regard to the other dimension, the breadth of copyright? Which uses of a copyrighted work should copyright cover? Well, in the age of the printing press, copyright was not supposed to cover all uses of a copyrighted work. In fact, copyright was the exception. People started with the natural right to do whatever they wished with these works. And then copyright law said that some uses were restricted. But philosophically speaking, that was the exception. However, the publishers thought that digital technology gave them an opportunity to grab total power to control all uses of a copyrighted work through designing the digital technology to control and restrict us. In other words, DRM. So they began the war on sharing. It actually started with propaganda. They started calling people pirates if they shared with each other, if they cooperated with the rest of society. Now this is perverse, because piracy means attacking ships. Pirates don't use computers, they don't use software, they use guns. And it's very, very wrong. I want to do away with piracy, and the way to do that is with the Navy and with other armed groups placed on ships to protect them from pirates. To a large extent, that particular battle has been successful, but it's got nothing to do with sharing. We shouldn't refer to sharing with other people by the same word to describe robbing ships. So I refuse. When people ask me what I think of movie piracy, I say, I like the first Pirates of the Caribbean. Because that's what movie piracy was. Sharing is not piracy. Sharing is sharing. But when I say sharing, I mean non-commercial copying of exact copying of published works. In any case, yeah?
One question. What do you say about free of you genetic coding?
Sorry, that's it. Please don't bring up topics now. Wait till the end. Let me get finished, okay?
Yes.
So, right now, if you don't understand what I said and you want clarification, then ask right away. Other questions save for the end, please. So, if they had only used propaganda, it would be nasty, but they have a right to say what they wish, and it's not war. But they went further than that. They started perverting our technology with digital restrictions management, designing our computers and software to restrict us rather than serve us. And that is perverse. It should be a crime. I think that those who make or distribute anything designed with DRM should go to prison for that. But in any case, people started trying to break the DRM systems and succeeding, which is good. But we can't assume we will always succeed. No one has completely broken the DRM on Blu-ray discs with free software that's available to us. Not that I've heard. And now the World Wide Web Consortium betrayed the community by giving its stamp of legitimacy to a system of DRM for the World Wide Web. And that is starting to be used. And I don't know if anyone's going to be able to break that DRM. I hope so. But who knows? However, people began sharing copies in other ways. So the US first, followed by some other countries, passed a law to punish people for breaking DRM, punish people for releasing programs that you can use to break DRM. And that is an oppressive, evil law, which should be repealed. But that didn't fully stop people, and people started sharing with peer-to-peer methods. So various countries decided they wanted to make it easy to punish people for sharing. So they decided to get rid of the basic principle of justice: no punishment without a fair trial. They said the mere accusation would be enough. Someone would say, you're accused of sharing, and you'd be punished. No need for proof. So we've seen repression encouraged by the war on sharing. But that didn't stop it. You know, people are still sharing peer-to-peer. So, in Japan, they passed a law that people can be sentenced to 2 years in prison for downloading without authorization any copy of anything from the internet. And if that's not enough, I suppose they'll start executing people for that. Because basically what those oligarchs want is more money and power, and they don't have much in the way of moral scruples. You want clarification? I can't hear you at all. I'm sorry, I have hearing problems. Don't worry, tell me later you'll have a microphone to use. So, they're trying to impose with DRM a pay-per-view universe where you can't look at anything unless you've been given specific permission for that glimpse. Well, what should we do with copyright law? First of all, there's a dimension of time. We should shorten copyright. I recommend a copyright last for 10 years from the date of publication of a work. Until the work is published, we're not in any hurry. We don't have any copies. So it doesn't matter whether we would be allowed to copy them or not. And we might as well let the author or artist have as long as it takes to arrange publication and then start the clock. 10 years is a reasonable time. In the US, most works go out of print in 3 years. Most books. And that means 10 years being 3 times as long, it should be enough for works to succeed and bring in money, if they're going to succeed. The exceptions are so few that economically they're not important, not as a reason to take away our freedom. I suggested this idea once at a panel discussion with fiction writers. I expected disagreement and I got it. An award-winning science fiction writer said, 10 years, no way, anything more than 5 years is intolerable. Well, I learned something there when he explained why. That's not what I had been told to expect from authors. After all, the publishers, when they're demanding increases in copyright power, they say that this is what the authors and artists need. And they bring out some very famous author that's bringing in millions. It's very rare that an author makes that much money. But there are a few, and some of them have been morally corrupted, and they say, I want more money, make my copyright more powerful, make the libraries pay for permission to lend my books, make my copyright last 1,000 years. And since those are the only ones we hear from, we don't know about the authors that don't agree with them. But this author had a legal dispute with his publisher. You see, his contract said that if the author let the book go out of print, the rights would revert to him. Well, his fans were saying, I can't get the book. I've written to the publisher. I'm trying to buy it from the publisher, but I can't. The publisher hasn't got it anymore, which means it was out of print. So the author wrote to the publisher and said, it's out of print, give me back the rights. I want to make copies for my fans. And the publisher said no. The publisher was using the copyright on his book to stop him from giving copies of his own book to his fans. Giving or selling, it doesn't matter. Either one would be fine. So he had realized that more than 5 years of copyright would probably never do him any good, but could easily do him harm. Well, if everybody wants 5 years, I'll go along with it. But certain special measures are needed for the case of software to prevent certain abuses from happening if copyright lasts less than 10 years. In any case, what about the dimension of breadth? Which uses should copyright cover and which should it not cover? For that, I distinguish three different classes of works. There are the works that are meant to do practical jobs. There are the works that express a particular person or entity's point of view or testimony, and there are works of art. Each of them gives something to society, but it's something different in each case. The works of practical use give us a way to do certain jobs. What are they? Well, there are programs. Computer programs are mostly works meant to be run and do a job. There are exceptions. There was the obfuscated C contest, and the submissions to that contest, which sometimes were very amusing to see, they were not written to actually run. They were works of art, but they are the rare exceptions. All the other programs were written for a practical purpose. But there are other works of practical use, recipes for cooking. And you'll notice that cooks share and change recipes as if they had the four freedoms. You know, this should start to show you that there's a systematic reason why. And then there are educational works, textbooks, for instance, and there are reference works, encyclopedias and dictionaries and so on. And there are patterns for sewing clothing. There are fonts for formatting paragraphs of text. There are 3D printer patterns for useful objects. And probably other things as well that you'll notice sooner or later. The point is, these works should all be free. The arguments for why software should be free apply to any work made for practical use. Also, diagrams for making hardware. That's also a work made for practical use. But those arguments don't apply to statements of a point of view, because those you don't use. You absorb them and then you think about the ideas you just saw and maybe you judge whether you agree or disagree. That's a different kind of dealing with the work than running it to do a job. So it's not vital for people to be allowed to publish modified versions of someone else's views. You can write down how you agree and how you disagree. So I think it would be acceptable for most of these works to have a somewhat reduced copyright system where sharing is legalized. And sharing has to be legalized. That is the minimum freedom that people need to have for any published work. You must be free to make exact copies and non-commercially distribute them to others. Because to forbid sharing is what has turned the copyright system into repression. That's where the injustice arises today. So if we legalize sharing, we can have a copyright system that covers all commercial use and all modification, and I think that that would be fine for works of opinion and point of view and testimony. Although there's one sort of exception. Scientific papers that report on experiments are, in a way, works of testimony, but it turns out to work perfectly fine for them to be free in, for instance, archive.org. So I believe that scientific papers should be free. So we should put an end to the paywall journals and their publishers. We should make all those articles free. And that's why Sci-Hub is a very good thing. And therefore, let me say 3 cheers for Alexandra Elbakian. But then what about artistic works? The issue of modification was difficult for me for artistic works. On the one hand, an artistic work can have an artistic integrity, and changing it can ruin the integrity. It can happen. And yet, artists are more likely to talk about this integrity than really respect it. When you see how authors of books permit those books to be butchered when they're made into movies, I guess integrity wasn't really so much on their minds. On the other hand, there are a few books I've seen which were made into movies which respected them. It can be done. But on the other hand, modifying an artistic work can be a contribution to art. So what should we do about modification of artistic works? I realized that if copyright lasts only 10 years, after 10 years you could publish your modified version. So during that time, it's okay to have a reduced copyright system that permits sharing, non-commercial redistribution of exact copies, but covers all commercial use and all modification. That would be for 10 years, and then afterwards it would go into the public domain and people could do what they wish. So this is what I mainly propose to change in copyright law, but there's a little bit more we have to discuss. First of all, we have to legalize remix. Remix means taking pieces of various works and putting them together and making a totally different work, which is, as a whole, not even similar to any of those. Well, this is the sort of thing that copyright should encourage. But nowadays, copyright on all the little pieces you might copy has become an obstacle to making works. So remix should be legalized. Another point, if copyright doesn't stop you from making copies, what about DRM? Well, we have to prohibit DRM. What about contracts? What if there's a vicious system like Netflix or Spotify that makes you agree that you won't share copies, you won't give your copy to someone else or lend your copy to someone else? What if this right that we hope to win is taken away by making people agree to contracts? The law needs to say that terms like that in a contract are void. That's the way to do it. Because otherwise they'll say, this contract is signed in the United States of America and is covered by United States law. Well, if other countries say a condition like this in a contract which forbids sharing copies is legally void in this country, and never mind where you agreed to the contract or anything else about it, in this country, your freedom to share is protected. Now, the copyright industry will say that this would be a disaster, it would be stealing from the artists. That's bullshit. The copyright industry takes almost everything from almost all the artists and leaves very little that anyone else could possibly steal. But to the extent that the copyright system supports artists, it would do more or less the same job with these changes. However, that might not be enough. The existing copyright system is not adequate for supporting the arts. It gives a few artists tremendous amounts of money. And most of them, almost all artists, get so little they can't live on it at all. So I'm in favor of trying to support artists better, but not by repressing everybody. I have other proposals, other systems which can do it. Here are two of them. One system would work through the public budget. There would be a certain amount of money for a year to support artists based on their popularity. Why based on their popularity? Well, that's what the copyright system is supposed to do, so I'm just being conservative there. And you can measure popularity by things like anonymous surveys. You could have your player fill out an anonymous survey for you, and so that way they could compute the popularity of each artist and distribute the money based on the popularity. But here's where most proposals go wrong. They propose linear proportionality. Twice as popular, twice as much money. But that gives bad results, because a star, if A is a star, A could easily have 1,000 times the popularity of another fairly successful and capable artist, B. And with linear proportionality, A will get 1,000 times as much money as B, which means almost all the money goes to a few stars and doesn't really help the arts at all. So I propose to take the cube root of each artist's popularity. The cube root of 1,000 is 10. With the cube root, A, who is 1,000 times as popular as B, will get 10 times as much money as B, instead of 1,000 times. Which means the cube root moves most of the money from the few stars to the not quite stars. The artists that right now don't get very much money and need a day job. This is where more money would really help the arts, because it would enable those artists, many of them, not to need a day job anymore, and they could dedicate themselves fully to their art. So this would use our money much more efficiently than the existing copyright system, which mainly supports businesses and rent seekers. But I have another idea which is based on voluntary payments. They should be anonymous, of course. So the idea is that each player has a button, and if you push the button, it sends a payment to whoever the artists were that made the last thing you watched or the last thing you played. And you can push the button or not. It's totally up to you. And no one will punish you or harass you if you don't. But if you do, you will feel good. So instead of the cruel publicity of the copyright industry, we could say, have you sent something to an artist today? Give it a try. Push the button on your player. See how good it feels. In fact, voluntary payments are being used by some artists, and they're getting some, and it's good. So let's do more of this kind cooperation instead of repression and cruelty. So now it's time. I think I would like, even though I normally don't do this, except in the speeches about free software, I think I will present to you my other identity. hear that. I have hearing problems. It's, you have to speak very clearly for me, I'm sad to say. And there's nothing I can do about it.
Let's go to the feedback.
I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a program, an extensible text editor that I had written, which then developed over the years into a way of life for many users, because they extended it so much that they could do all their computing without ever leaving Emacs. Then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which used to be amusing to visit. It has gone out of use. I hope that it will be restored to vibrancy again. It was used to publish wordplay. In the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between various versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the confession of the faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a true expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Bar Mitzvah, in which you chant a portion of our sacred scriptures. That is to say, the system source code. In the Church of Emacs, we have abolished the priesthood of technology because everyone is free to read our sacred scriptures. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which means anyone who has never used or known Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a breakaway Tibetan sect which claims that it's sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script. But the Mother Church holds that to gain spiritual merit, you must type them by hand. My visit to Russia has made me aware that the Church of Emacs needs icons. The thing is, the true believers mostly use text-only terminals where no icons can be displayed. So we're going to have to work on that. The Church of Emacs has advantages compared with other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system where holy can be spelled in more than one way, and then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you'll have the right to wear a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. There is a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other editor, VI. So occasionally people ask whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. Well, it's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. 5 years ago, I went to China and some users of VI spoke about finding me on the street and attacking me. I was shocked, but apparently violence begins with VI. People sometimes ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. Thank you. Now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you are upstairs and you want to bid, I suggest you come down so that I'll be able to see you more easily. It would be a shame if you tried to bid and I didn't see. If you win, if you buy the GNU, I can sign the card for you. If you have a penguin at home, you need to get a GNU for your penguin. There should never be a penguin without a GNU. We can accept payment in cash or with a bank card if it can make international purchases by phone, or through Bitcoin if you have something to make a payment with here. Is there a bank machine near here? So if someone wants to get cash out of the bank, is there a machine near here?
Yes, we have this.
Okay, good. So that's another option. You can, if you win the auction, you can then go out, get the money, come back while I'm answering questions. I'll be here for quite a while. Don't worry, you'll have time. And when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount because you want me to hear you, and I